Good morning, Real Life Church. It's great to be with you today online. My name's Anthony.
And I'm Stacy.
We have some incredible things coming up in the life for our church. One of them is tomorrow.
It's true. So tomorrow night, Alpha starts, and that is a gathering that includes super yummy food, drinks, discussion around tables where all questions are welcome. Here's the part that we need your help with. We need to know if you're coming or if you're coming with a friend, which is preferable, because we are ordering food for that. So reallife.la/alpha. And if you're not watching it the day before Alpha, if you're watching a little bit later, but Alpha's still going on every Monday in February and into March, you can still RSVP for Alpha right now. Just don't forget.
And then later this month on the 21st, which is a Friday, we have an event here at the church called Art After Dark. We're in the middle of a teaching series where Jim is helping us look at great pieces of art and apply them to faith. And we thought, hey, let's bring in some contemporary stuff. Let's bring in a live band. Let's give you a space the week after Valentine's Day to come hang out with us. It's going to be great. Snacks are going to be there. You don't have to RSVP, but you do need to put it on your calendar. That is on the 21st at 7 o'clock.
That's correct. And church, we just want to say thank you for how generous you are. This past weekend, we took a gaggle of children and leaders up to camp, and it was fantastic. So when you go to reallife.la/give, you make it possible for kids who might not otherwise have had the camp experience to go. So thank you so much for being part of that journey. Thanks for praying for us. We are excited for what Pastor Jim is going to teach about today. We're going to throw to him, and we'll see you right here after that.
Hey, I have a question for you. Where are you right now? Sitting in front of a TV or on a device, nestled somewhere in the San Gabriel Valley or maybe further away? You might not be exactly where you think you are. The Bible exposes people who say confidently, "Here I am," only to find out they weren't where they thought they were. Think about how many different ways we aren't exactly where we think we are right now. Right now, the Earth is spinning on its axis some 25,000 mile circumference, which means we're traveling at over 1,000 miles an hour every day, headed east, which is roughly that way. You're constantly in motion, whether you're aware of it or not. And on top of that, our little globe is spinning around the sun. So even if you sat absolutely still for 24 hours, you wouldn't be in the same place tomorrow morning that you are right now. We're never exactly where we think we are, and there's more going on than we're aware of. That's certainly been one of the deep truths of psychology since Sigmund Freud a century ago. We're vaguely aware that we're subject to all kinds of impulses and urges and subconscious desires and things that affected us in our childhood that we're not entirely conscious of and certainly don't have control over. On top of that, there may have been things that have already happened to us that we just haven't become aware of yet. Perhaps somebody told you a lie that you're not aware was a lie yet, and you're suffering the consequences of it before having realized it. We don't know the moment we become sick. A cell mutates, and we don't become aware until sometime later when we get a diagnosis. So we could be in a state right now that we're not entirely conscious of. And Jesus will say spiritually that we're not necessarily where we think we are. He says all of us are on a pathway, and it's a pathway as though it were in motion. Some of us are on a path that, he says, leads to destruction. Wide is the gate and wide the path that leads to destruction, and narrow is the road that leads to life, and few are those who find it. We're on one path or another, he would say, without necessarily being conscious of it. When you start to think about where you are and who you are, you suddenly realize that you're a little bit more disoriented than you knew. I remember being in the hospital one time, visiting a man who was weeping. He had lost everything. He had gotten to a point in his life where he said, look, here I am. I've established my career and I'm rich and I bought a Corvette and I have an empire and I have a lovely girlfriend and everything is going my way. And then his finances fell apart and he lost his Corvette and his girlfriend left him. And then he lost his health insurance and sure enough, lost his health. And now he was in the hospital in absolute crisis because he at one point in his life had said, here I am. I know where I am. I know what I'm doing. Only to find out he had not quite so much control over who he was and where he was going as he thought. Here I am, we say, but we don't know where we are. Confidence is always a bit of a game. Some people say faith begins when you believe in Jesus, and I guess that's true enough. Some people say it's before you even say you believe because God calls to us before we call to him. But I think there's a significant moment of faith when we admit that we just don't know where we are. In fact, that begins an important journey of faith. I want to read you a passage from Genesis 22 in which Abraham, who has become known as the father of faith, says at two different points, here I am. The first time he says it, he doesn't actually know. And the second time he says that something has changed. Sometime later, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, here I am, Abraham replied. Then God said, take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. He took with him two of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, Father? Yes, my son, Abraham replied. The fire and the wood are here, Isaac said, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abraham answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. And the two of them went on together. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him now. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Abraham looked up, and there in the thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possessions of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. Put this in context. Abraham was a man surrounded by pagan religions. In the ancient Mediterranean world, a god that was commonly worshipped among the Canaanites was the god Molech, who was a terrible god, a god with a body of a man and a bull's head. And the people of Molech worshipped him by offering sacrifices. They would bring him grain to stop droughts and crops to stop storms. Huge shrines were built to Molech. Inside the shrines, they were made to be an oven with several caverns in the chest and a bull's head. And inside the various caverns, they would place different animals and light a fire underneath it. And as the fire contorted the iron of the statue, it would flex its muscles and look like it had come alive. Inside these statues were often placed a goat or a bull or a bag of grain, a dove, a sheep, or a ram, and sometimes a human child. They believed in giving up their own, and then they expected they would be forgiven by their angry God. They would stand around the burning statue and chant, "We are not men, we are oxen." In 1921, a cemetery was uncovered in Carthage, Greece, which had an inscription to the god Molech, and in the cemetery were found the remains of animals and children by the thousands. Abraham would have seen and known these worship practices. Now, Abraham followed a different kind of God. His God had called him to a new home and promised him that he would one day have as many children as there were stars in the sky. The Hebrew Bible is clear. God would say, "Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of the Lord your God. I am the Lord." For the rest of the Bible, Molech is referred to as a detestable God. But a moment comes in Abraham's journey of faith in which his own God tells him, "Sacrifice your child," like the followers of Molech did. And Abraham followed God's call. He gave up everything for God. Everywhere he had gone, he had profited. God had added to his flocks and his crops and his herds, and Abraham had gotten rich. And he comes to a point where God calls to him, and Abraham says, "Here I am. I built my empire. Everything's great. Everything's going well." Abraham had even had a son late in age, his son Isaac, of whom he was proud. He would have enjoyed the days where people started calling him Isaac's dad instead of Abraham. Then one day, Abraham was living in the hill country and the lands that would one day be called Israel and belong to his descendants. And God said to him, "Give me your son." Everything in him would have reeled. This God who had given him everything was now going to take it away. "Go to Mount Moriah and sacrifice your son to me." And Abraham gave up everything. He gave up his will to decide for God. He surrendered everything to the God who had seemed to be so good to him, believing that God must somehow know what he was doing despite this horrible call. Now, this moment has been depicted in all kinds of artwork, but my favorite one comes from the painter Salvador Dali, a 20th century Spanish painter, in a painting called Abraham, Abraham. It's not one of his most famous, but it's my favorite. You can look it up online if you want to see it. At first, it looks like a Rorschach test, a big blotch in the middle of the painting. As you stare at it for a while, eventually a figure starts to come clear, small and animalistic on the left-hand side. And you realize it's holding a knife and is standing over the body of another person. And you realize that's Abraham offering Isaac. So what's the big blotch in the middle of the screen? What's the blur that dominates the painting? The longer you stare at it, the more clear it may become. You start to realize you're looking at the back of the angel with its wings outstretched. And what Dali shows us in the painting is that this is the moment in which Abraham realizes where he really is in the universe. Off-center, small, animalistic, and fragile. And at the center of the painting is the messenger of God, the voice of God, the will of God. Dali is telling us that the center of the universe is properly God himself and not humanity. When God first calls to Abraham in verse 1, Abraham says, "Here I am," but Abraham does not yet know who he is. It's not until he has gone through the horrible willingness to surrender everything to God that he finds out this God truly is good and is not like Molech and will not require the sacrifice of children. This God actually does love him and want to provide for him. But only when he surrendered everything could he truly discover that. It's when God becomes the center of Abraham's universe that Abraham moves from being the father of Isaac to the father of faith. Sometimes God has to disorient us to set us straight. And you may be in one of those seasons of your life right now where you have lost a job or a spouse or a state of living, and it feels like it's gone for good. And God is calling you to trust him all the same. And in your heart, you might be resentful, thinking, how could a good God have allowed this to happen? Faith begins when we recognize we've been saying, here I am, and we didn't know where we were. Faith begins when God steps into the center of the universe and we truly realize where we are. All of our life is wired to put us at the center. I think back to when my kids were little, sitting in their crib, and they figured out before they could speak that if they called out or cried, they would suddenly be surrounded by warm faces that would reach down and feed them and change them and care for them and put them back to bed. And they must have felt like the center of the universe there in their crib. As they got older, they had friends, and it was fun to watch them play with their little friends. But if you read the writings of Jean Piaget, you realize that when children speak to each other, it's not to communicate, it is only to be heard. They're still little narcissists. They're still the center of their own universe. As we grow into adulthood and we seek out job and career and wealth and status and relationship, much of what we do is simply motivated by selfishness. There are some adults who never step out of the center of their own world. They are the center from beginning to end. But the act of faith is realizing we don't properly properly belong at the center. Life is only lived rightly when God is at the center of our lives and our universe. If you want to live life right, you have to put God in the center. When we do, we find out that this really is a good God. Life will rob us and leave us empty-handed. But with God in the center of the universe, we have all that we need. You know, there's a funny thing about the hill country in which Abraham lived, which would later become Israel. Nobody knows exactly where this hill was, but it's believed to be somewhere outside of Jerusalem. And we know actually there's another hill there that was called the place of the skull because it actually looks like there was a skull in the rock there. It would not at all surprise me if in the poetry of God, this was the same hill on which another son was called to be sacrificed, bound and surrendered. But this time, God himself would take the place of humanity's sacrifices. God would put himself in the place of people who could not be forgiven without sacrifice for all that they had done wrong. In that moment, humanity would de-center God by crucifying him. And God would accept our rejection. Because in dying on the cross, God shows us, I am the God of love. I will not require sacrifice for you. I will spare your children and take their place in the fire, if only you will believe in me. We have to be disoriented in order to be set straight. Our sins de-centered God. Our decision to put Jesus back at the center reorients us. Christians sometimes act like all we have to do is sign on the dotted line, say, yes, I believe in the right doctrines, I've got the right facts down, here I am. I've got life all figured out now and I'm going to heaven, so I'm going to spend my life making money and being comfortable. Don't go on with that life. Make Jesus the center of everything. I talk to college students who go off to a college and they come home and visit and they say, hey, I never really found a church. And I tell them, then you picked the wrong college because God should have been the center of your planning and your decision making. I talk to people who are busy with important jobs and who say, oh, I don't have time for church. I've got too much going on. And I ask them, what would it profit you to gain the whole world and lose your soul? I knew a man who sat in church week after week, older guy, had kind of lived through his life at the center, sat in church week after week weeping. And his pastor finally asked him what's going on. And he says, I realize all the years I wasted. The call of faith is to step out of the center of our lives because the God of love has walked among us. He's died for us. He will never take away our children the way the office God does in late night hours and weeks away. How can we not have the humility to surrender to the God who really belongs at the center? This is Jesus, the God who loves us, the God who, rather than demanding sacrifice from us would become a sacrifice for us. Only when we surrender to Him and put Him in the center of our lives do we really understand what we mean when we say, "Here I am." Amen. God bless you. Have a great week.
Thanks, Pastor Jim, for continuing this super fun art series. Thank you for being here.
Hey, we are cheering for you. We are praying for you. It's going to be a great week here at Real Life. Tomorrow night is Alpha. I know Jim talked about it. We talked about it, but like for real, www.reallife.la/alpha. Let us know you're going to be here. And if you need anything, you can always shoot us an email, info@reallife.la. We will see you next week. Take care.